Welcome to another episode of Puff Daddy Reef, and today I'll be telling you about what is the next fishy that I'm putting in this tank. So on my last video, the one about the algae catastrophe where everything was going wrong and the tank looked disgusting, I asked you what should be the next thing that I put in my tank. And I got some good suggestions. Some people said put a yellow tang in there. Other people said maybe Anthias or Chromis or something like that. But the most liked comment was a cleanup crew. And I'm going to take your advice because one snail in there is not enough. I'm going to put a cleanup crew in my tank. But when I was thinking about putting my cleanup crew in, which is a band of banded Trochus snails that I hand raised myself, they actually bred in my tank, in my previous tank, and I'll post that video later if you're interested. Okay, let's keep this family friendly. But one thing I wanted to know was, can you dip your cleanup crew? Will they survive my standard coral dip? But before we get to that, I wanted to talk to you really quickly. My video that I posted last Wednesday was on this Kessel H380 Aquarium Light. So there she is humming away in my tank. Now this is a light specially designed to grow Chaetomorpha algae, well, specially designed to grow any type of green plant life matter, but it works really well for growing Chaetomorpha algae in a sump. This is used to take up excess nutrients. My question was at the time was, can I use this to outcompete all of the green stuff that was building up inside my tank? And I installed it, left it on for a few days, put a softball-sized chunk of Chaetomorpha in, and wow. In just 5 days, look what it produced. Also produced a lot of water, which is now on my floor. Good thing we always have an emergency towel at hand. But yeah, look what it produced. Tons and tons and tons of Chaetomorpha. And the other thing is, the green algae didn't come back. And I know it was because of adding this other source of competition for the nutrients, because I have to admit, after I made that last video where I cleaned up the tank and did the half the water change, all the green gunk came back until I cleaned it up, added this light, and got the Chaetomorpha going. And then it finally stabilized, and the algae has not been coming back in force in the display. So I just want to warn you, what I'm about to do is experimental. Now, I said cleanup crew, but I'm only trying this with one type of critter, my banded Trochus snail. I'm using my typical coral dip, which is a 5-minute dip in Bayer insecticide solution, and then an 8-minute dip in Coral RX. I'll show you the results, and then you can decide if this is something that you want to use on your snails. So I'm putting the snails through my coral regimen, and the first step when I get a coral is I get my little poker and I look at it and scrape off anything that might be of concern. Now typically I remove the bottom of the base of the corals, so there's really nothing to scrape. Here I'm using that poker and a little steel scrubbing pad to scrub off the shells of the snails. This ensures that the snails will be as clean as possible when I get to the dip. So my standard dipping procedure requires 3 buckets. I use 2 different chemicals. I use Bayer insecticide, and I mix that in a ratio of 160 milliliters per gallon for 5 minutes. The next step is I use Coral RX. I use the concentrated formula, and that is 30 drops of that in a gallon of water. The very last bucket is a rinse bucket. So after I put the little guys through the entire dipping process, then I will also move them later to rinse them to get all that gunk off before I get them in the tank. So here are the little guys, and what I'm doing is I'm trying to push them into their shell so their bodies aren't exposed to the chemicals. Mostly I just want to treat the shell to see if there's any hitchhikers on there, though they're very inspected, so I'm not too worried. So these snails are nice because they have a little trap door that they can close up, and if they stay in there, they should be completely fine. So I leave the guys in the Bayer insecticide no more than 5 minutes. So there I'm at 4 minutes and 45 seconds, getting them out immediately. I'm using a plastic bag. You should really use gloves or something, but the plastic bag was all I had available at the time. You want to try to keep this stuff off of your hands if possible. So I keep the snails in there, and they're in there for just about 8 minutes. I never go over 8 minutes. And then after that, it's time to get them into the rinse bucket. So this is where they'll go for just a little bit, and then I'll put them in the tank. One thing to note, all this water here that I'm using for the dip is actually the same water that is from my display tank. So there's actually no acclimation process, but I already checked the salinity of the two tanks so that they do match pretty closely before I start the process. So I realized pretty quickly that I needed to distract my fish from slaughtering my poor little snails and give them some time to recover. So I started to feed them, and then I also turned off the lights to convince the wrasse to take a nap, go to bed, and maybe that'll give the snails a chance to escape. So I drew a little circle around them to see where they ended up going. They started moving within about 15 minutes. Then the next morning I checked, and they had basically cleaned a little area and then all drifted to the back of the tank. I found most of them in the back of the tank, kind of creeping up, hanging underneath this rock structure. Some of them were in the corners and different nooks. Anyway, that's my video. I hope I answered some questions. If you can subject these snails to a typical dipping routine to help keep critters that you don't want out of your tank. If you have any comments, leave them below. Please subscribe, because I got new videos on the way.